Politics. It's a dirty word. We say, I was having a great conversation until he made it political. That last word is meant to be distasteful, to make us dislike the cretin who ruined our fun, who took a perfectly good conversation, spoiled it. Some pointless discussion of how the federal government spends its bloated budget. Some of you right now might be worried that I might start talking politics. So before we can talk about how and why education is necessarily and obviously political, we have to do some work to recover an older meaning of this word, politics. In his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle says that every art and every action, likewise every inquiry, seems to aim at some good. That everything we do, all of our contemplation, has purpose, and to tell us. Theoretically, you all have a purpose in being here listening to me. Theoretically, I have a purpose in speaking. If you make a hammer, you don't make it for the sake of having a hammer. Just admire. You make it for the sake of building something with it. These are the intermediate ends. Right? You might build a house with it, and you might enjoy the house for its beauty. That's not the real reason we would build a house. The primary reason we would build a house is so that somebody could live in it. But they don't just live in it for the sake of shelter from the elements and staying alive. They live in it ultimately for the sake of having a good life there. He goes on to say that these goods tend to converge as they go up. That the purposes and arts come together. The house is more complex and more important than the hammer. That the good life lived in the house requires many other things besides shelter, and that all those things are done in part for the sake of that good life. He says that all the arts that we do in our lives seem to converge on one master art. The art for which all the other arts are done, and at which they all aim. And he calls that the art of politics. A somewhat higher view than what we have. Because he says the most honored capacities, such as generalship, household economics, and rhetorical skill, are all under this one. Not only do these most important arts aim at and serve the art of politics, but he goes on to say that politics has as its goal the highest good. He says, the highest good is the end of politics, while it takes the greatest part of its pains to produce citizens of a certain sort, namely ones that are good and inclined to perform beautiful actions. It wasn't just Aristotle either. The Greeks and Romans almost universally had a high view of politics and government. We can see in Plato's Laws and Republic, he thought the purpose of politics was to ensure justice in the polis for the sake of virtue, excellence, and the happiness of the citizens. Happiness is another word that we should probably try to recover. Doesn't mean giddiness. Cicero says that government exists to uphold natural law, to ensure justice, to provide for the liberty of the citizens under that law. Seneca praises as the best government that which brings peace, justice, liberty without license, and the happiness of the citizens. So Aristotle is not alone in claiming that the highest goods, the best things for men, are the purpose, the aim of government. But you might be thinking as a Christian, all of these are pagans, and they're missing out on the true summum bonum. And we also know that no earthly government can actually produce true righteousness. It can, however, encourage and require civic righteousness, which is maybe not the highest good, but it's pretty good, especially in our wicked and fallen world. And so Luther also gives secular government great honor, saying that while earthly government doesn't aim at the highest good, it imitates that which does. He says, the spiritual government or authority should direct the people vertically toward God, that they may do right and be saved. Just so, the secular government should direct the people horizontally toward one another, seeing to it that body, property, honor, wife, child, house, home, and all manner of goods remain in peace and security and are blessed on earth. God wants the government of the world to be a symbol of true salvation and of his kingdom of heaven, like a pantomime or a mask. So, while good government might not bring us to true righteousness, salvation is supposed to look like it. God doesn't use exactly these words when he tells us about the governments of this world, but he does call those in authority his ministers, who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of what is good. The ruler, God says, is here for your good and to execute God's wrath on those who do evil. Pretty high goods there as well. So, both classically and for the Christian, politics is that art which aims at the best things of this world. Justice, peace, the upholding of the natural law, preservation of the great goods that God has given us, praising and upholding virtue, punishing and destroying vice. So what does all this have to do with education? Well, might also do some consideration of this word before the connection becomes, as I promised at the start, obvious and necessary. Thank you. The first thing to stress here is that education is about formation of the student. It is concerned more with what the child will grow up to be than what the student will know about. For those of you who went to Dr. Boyle's presentation yesterday, it might seem like I'm contradicting him, but I'm not. When he says to know Christ, I don't think he means to know about Christ. The demons know more about Christ than most of us, but I don't think he meant that they were educated in a classically Lutheran way. The idea that the being of the student matters more than the facts he knows may also seem counterintuitive, because we, especially at schools, are constantly testing to see what the student knows, what he knows about. We have very few tests on who the student is. But we can apply the Aristotelian principle from earlier here as well, that the knowing of the facts is both for the sake of knowing them, because they're good to know, but also for the higher sake of the formation of the mind and the soul those facts have. So once we accept this idea that education is about forming the student to be something, the next obvious question is, to be what? And then the one right after that is, how do we do that? That second question is well outside the scope of this particular presentation. But the former goes to the heart of what we have been talking about. What is he to be formed to be? And the answer, in sort of oversimplified form, from both the classics and the Christians, is that we would form him to be a good man, to love virtue and to live in that virtue. The Greeks wanted to educate the ideal man. Formal education in the Greek polis was oriented towards passing down Greek culture, not like something that you could hand along in a bucket or a list of books that define Greek culture, but by making the student over time to be truly Greek, passing down the culture by making the child a bearer of that culture, making him to instinctively admire whatever is Greek. to look down on and despise that which was not, calling it barbarian. But this goes beyond the simple sort of common parochial love of one's own, which we would expect in all societies. They wanted him to be Greek because they thought that the Greek was the ideal man, superior to all others in courage, strength, eloquence, and wisdom. Werner Jaeger, in his great work, Paideia, The Ideals of Greek Culture, describes Greek education as the process of educating a man into his true form, the real and genuine human nature. That is the true Greek Paideia. He goes on to say, the ideal of human character, which they wished to educate each individual to attain, was not an empty, abstract pattern existing outside time and space. It was the living ideal which had grown up in the very soil of Greece and changed with the changing fortunes of the race, assimilating every stage of its history and intellectual development. We can see this idea of education playing out in the greatest treatise from the Greek world on education, Plato's Republic. Socrates, in this dialogue, is ostensibly answering the question, what is justice? He spends more than half of the book setting up an ideal city, where we would theoretically see what justice is more clearly. This city in speech. The majority of the time that he spends setting up the city, he spends talking about how to teach the citizens. And while he has a variety of different kinds of education for the different kinds of people in the city, his highest goal is to educate the philosopher king. The man who is not only as brave and well-trained as the best soldier in the city, but who also has a true knowledge of the highest goods and the rhetorical and ethical capacity to lead others to those. This obviously idealized version of Greek education does reflect something about what the Greeks were actually trying to do, to educate the best men to be courageous, strong, eloquent, and wise. The Romans, when they took Greece captive, adopted their idea of public education. Before this, the Romans had done pretty much exclusively educating in the home. He said, well, the Greeks are doing this thing where they're going to send the children to a school, and we're going to do that also. And while many of the Greek ideals captivated the Romans, there were some differences, at least of emphasis. The education of the Roman began through an inculcation in pietas. Well, pietas certainly includes what we call piety, the fulfilling of our duties toward God, living Christian life. It also had the aspect of filial piety, the heavy emphasis on giving honor and respect, reverence to one's father, one's city, one's country, ancestors. Pietas was one of the most important virtues to the Romans, the virtue most famously associated with Aeneas, the mythical founder of the city. It was the foundation of education, the first thing taught, and the fulfilling of pietas was the goal and purpose of the virtues that were taught in the education. More practically, the Roman education aimed to produce an orator. Hearing this, we might think of vocal lessons or acting school. They meant something far more serious than that. They wanted to educate the young Roman to have the virtues and the powers of eloquence to help run the republic through good laws and just judgments. Quintilian describes the education of an orator, saying, "We are to form, then, the perfect orator, who cannot exist unless as a good man. And we require in him, therefore, not only consummate ability in speaking, but every excellence of mind. For I cannot admit the principle of moral and honorable conduct are, as some have thought, to be left to the philosophers, since the man who can duly sustain his character as a citizen, who is qualified for the management of public and private affairs, and who can govern communities by councils, settle them by means of laws, and improve them by judicial enactments, can certainly be nothing but an orator. You can hear the filial piety in his list of the good things the order is going to be able to do. He is to be virtuous and eloquent enough in order to be a good citizen, leader, and ruler. 150 years earlier or so, Cicero had said much the same thing. In De Oratore, he says that no man can be an orator, complete in all points of merit, who has not attained a knowledge of all the important subjects and arts. And in De Officiis, he adds that this knowledge of philosophy must include a knowledge of duties, of ethics, which he says requires a knowledge of moral virtue and how it applies to our lives. But in neither work does he stop at just a sort of a head knowledge. He says this must come out in the way they live. They must imitate the best examples of statesmanship and virtue. They must live out this knowledge to actually become virtuous, eloquent, dutiful, and pious. They must become Roman. Seneca says that the only education worth having is one that paves the way to virtue, dispels fear, roots out desire, and reins in passions. Tells us not to be afraid of this or to desire that. And if anyone lacks this kind of knowledge, all his other knowledge is valueless to him. He says the only thing you need to know about any teacher is whether or not he is teaching virtue. So again, we see that for the Romans, education must form the student to virtue. And we'll see later that Seneca, even though he is a little bit stoical, also thinks that this leads to politics. But we are here to talk about Lutheranism and the classics. So, what did the Lutherans have to say about education? Luther himself was intensely interested in and devoted to the state of education at this time. He spoke of it often. He wrote a 40-page letter to the nobility, exhorting them to build and maintain good schools, and a 50-page sermon on keeping children in school. You should be pleased that your pastors are not giving 50-page sermons. He spoke on many other occasions on the topic and has many other writings on them. Throughout them, he focuses on the capacities that education will give the child. And his focus is on the capacities to serve his neighbor in the family, church, and the civil realm. He says that an education ought to produce adults who are good, capable, godly, intelligent, wise, and competent. This, he says, will prepare them to be good fathers and mothers, also pastors, theologians, and rulers. Like the Romans, he wanted virtuous citizens, and even expressly praises Roman education, as we'll see later. But like Augustine, he reorients the focus towards heavenly citizenship first, and earthly citizenship second. He says, I would advise no one to send his child where the Holy Scriptures are not supreme. Every institution that does not unceasingly pursue the study of God's word becomes corrupt. I greatly fear that the universities, unless they teach the Holy Scriptures diligently and impress them on the young students, are wide gates to hell. So he does not throw out the filial piety, as we can see from his explanations in Fourth Commandment, but he puts it in its proper place, behind the piety of God. Melanchthon echoes this idea in his oration on studying the classical languages, saying, just as it is said that men are not born for themselves only, but for their country, I could say even more truthfully that all good men have to consider themselves born chiefly for the church. The child is to be educated then, not only because it will be good for him, but also because it will serve first the church, and then also the state. Elsewhere, Melanchthon says that the goal of education is to form the students to be good and virtuous men who would admire virtue in others, to be honest and do their duty, he summarized the goal of this education as a learned piety. One of Melanchthon's famous students, Johannes Sturm, would use a similar language, saying that the purpose of education is to instill in students a wise and eloquent piety. Sturm helped to found and run the famous school in Strasbourg that would become a model for schools all over Europe. And in describing how it should operate, he says the boys should become well-mannered, virtuous, well-spoken, pious, and knowledgeable. In these ways, he says, they will be a credit to their families and to the state. So, education as understood by the Greeks, Romans, and Lutherans can be described as the formation of a good man, a man of wisdom, virtue, strength, piety, and eloquence. Such a man would love his family, his city, his nation, and, for the Christian, God above all things. He would use the capacities gained from this education to serve those things that he loves. So I hope it's beginning to become clear how education and politics must of necessity be intertwined. If the city or state is interested in promoting the virtue of its citizens, upholding the natural law, and preventing vice, it must take care that the students, the children, are educated properly. Education is also how we pass down the ideas of what is virtuous and vicious, what is good and evil, how we fix those ideas in the minds of future generations. Jaeger, again, explains this well, saying that education is not a practice which concerns the individual alone. It is essentially a function of the community. The character of the community is expressed in the individuals who compose it, and for man, the zoon politikon, far more than any other animal species, the community is the source of all behavior. The formative influence of the community on its members is most constantly alive in its deliberate endeavor to educate each new generation of individuals so as to make them in its own image. The structure of every society is based on the written or unwritten laws which bind it and its members. Therefore, education in any human community, be it a family, a social class, a profession, or some wider complex such as a race or state, is the direct expression of its active awareness of a standard. So if we want our standard of right and wrong, of good and evil to continue, we have to teach it. This standard is what makes up what the polity is. If the Greeks stopped loving physical excellence and virtue, they would stop being Greek. The way we educate children will either uphold or destroy the character of the community itself. Aristotle says this in his Politics. Nobody would dispute that the education of the young requires the special attention of the lawgiver. Indeed, the neglect of this in states is injurious to their constitutions, for education ought to be adapted to the particular form of constitution, since the particular character belonging to each constitution both guards the constitution generally and originally established it. So if we want our states to continue under their same constitution, in their same character, we need to educate citizens who uphold the principles of that constitution, who have the virtues necessary for it. If instead we change the education of the citizens, we will ultimately undermine and destroy the Constitution and that character and replace it with another that will follow the principles that we have inculcated through our new education. I said we'd come back to Seneca and see how the educating a virtuous man might be political. Seneca says that true virtue is to fear and love the right things, to act in the right way, and also to be of service to our country. And this is sort of a long quotation, but it's beautiful and edifying. He says, "This is what I think ought to be done by virtue, and by one who practices virtue. If fortune gets the upper hand and deprive him of the power of action, let him not straightway turn his back to the enemy, throw away his arms, and run away seeking for a hiding place. as if there were any place whither fortune could not pursue him. But let him be more sparing in his acceptance of public office, and after due deliberation discover some means by which he can be of use to the state. He is not able to serve in the army, then let him be a candidate for civic honors. Must he live in a private station? Then let him be an advocate. Is he condemned to keep silence? Then let him help his countrymen with silent counsel. Is it dangerous for him to even enter the forum? Then let him prove himself a good comrade, a faithful friend, a sober guest in people's houses, at public shows, and at wine parties. If fortune removes you from the front rank, stand your ground nevertheless, and cheer on your comrades. And if someone stops your mouth, stand nevertheless and help your side in silence. The services of a good citizen are never thrown away. He does good by being heard and seen, by his expression, his gestures, his silent determination, and his very walk. As some remedies benefit us by their smell as well as their taste and touch, so virtue, even when concealed and at a distance, sheds usefulness around. So, if we want good citizens who might shed their usefulness around, we must educate them to virtue. And if we do educate them to virtue, their services will not go to waste. But again, what about the Lutherans? Should not their education be concerned with the city of God and not the city of man? Certainly, one should be in the first place and the other second. But the Lutherans, and especially Luther, held a very high view of temporal government as one of the greatest blessings that God has given us. Therefore, we need to educate the young so that they would, as Seneca says, be of service to their nation. In fact, Luther bragged that no one had praised God's institution of the temporal government as much as he had. And he goes on to say, it is not necessary to repeat here that the temporal government is a divinely ordained state. The question is rather, how are we to get good and capable men into it? Here we are excelled and put to shame by the pagans of old, especially the Romans and Greeks. Although they had no idea whether the state was pleasing to God or not, they were so earnest and diligent in educating and training their young boys and girls to fit them for this task, that when I call it to mind, I am forced to blush for us Christians, and especially for us Germans. Yet we know, or at least we ought to know, how essential and beneficial it is, and pleasing to God, that a prince, lord, councilman, or other person in a position of authority be educated and qualified to perform the functions of his office as a Christian should. Now, if, as we have assumed, there were no souls, and there were no need at all of schools and languages for the sake of the scriptures and not of God, this one consideration alone would be sufficient to justify the establishment everywhere of the very best schools for both boys and girls, namely that in order to maintain its temporal estate outwardly, the world must have good and capable men and women, men able to rule well over the land and people, and women able to manage the household and train children and servants aright. Now, such men must come from our boys, and such women from our girls. Therefore, it is a matter of properly educating and training our boys and girls to this end. So the temporal government is a gift from God, but we need qualified people to fill the offices, to perform its duties. And so we have to educate them to be fit for such a task. Melanchthon would expand on this point, saying that education is not only necessary to prepare people for service in government, but also he echoes Aristotle, saying that education has to be fit to the government that it is under, and that a change in education becomes a change in the government. Melanchthon says, Plato said that the state changes if it comes about that the music changes, and this is not said uselessly, but it is much truer that the state changes if studies are changed. And indeed, all changes of the state are of concern to the magistrates. An overturned order of studies brings with it the downfall of the greatest and best things. Therefore, the magistrates need to be more watchful about this than about anything else. So, not only do the teachers have the duty to educate children to become citizens able to serve their neighbors as the officers of the nation, But the governing authority has the obligation, the duty, to make sure that the education that the citizens receive is one fitting to produce good citizens. You must be watchful to make sure no evil creep in and undermine the good ends of politics. This is of the greatest importance. And Melanchthon says elsewhere, because unless we preserve good and classical literature, good laws cannot endure. So Luther and the Praeceptor Germaniae both agree that education ought to be ordered, if secondarily or perhaps tertiarily, toward the good of the nation. That the forms of education end up being determinative of the politics of the polity, and that therefore the governing authorities have an interest in education of their citizens and an obligation to make sure it is rightly ordered. Now, it may seem from the way I've presented these witnesses that I mean to show that there are these groups of people who all thought sort of subjectively that education and politics ought to be connected. But the tradition handed down to us from the Greeks and the Romans and our fathers in the faith is pointing us at universal truths, not subjective opinions. First, that the state requires virtuous citizens and rulers to flourish. Second, that education is always forming, always teaching virtue or vice. And the only question is, which one? Third, that education will shape the future of the state for good or ill. Again, Luther. So it was done in ancient Rome. Their boys were so taught that by the time they reached their 15th, 18th, or 20th year, they were well versed in Latin, Greek, and all the liberal arts, and then immediately entered upon a political or military career. Their systems produced intelligent, wise, and competent men, so skilled in every art and rich in experience that if all the bishops, priests, and monks in the whole of Germany today were rolled into one, you would not have the equal of one Roman soldier. As a result, their country prospered, and they had capable and trained men for each position. So at all times throughout the world, simple necessity has forced men, even among the heathen, to maintain pedagogues and schoolmasters if their nation was to be brought to a high standard. Fourth, the state has an interest in the education of its citizens, and maybe fourth and a half or fifth, the state has the duty to ensure good education because its purpose is to promote the good of the citizens. Aristotle says the education of the young has a special claim on the lawgiver's attention. So what does all this mean for us? This reality that education and politics are necessarily intertwined. I think it should shape our thoughts and actions, both as teachers and as citizens. As citizens, we need to recognize that we all, through our government, have a legitimate interest in ensuring a good American Christian education for all citizens. In the long run, instead of trying to keep the government out of education, we should work toward making sure the government requires a good education, one that forms children to be good for the good of the nation, one that teaches filial piety towards parents, towards all those in authority in the nation itself. No more of this America-hating victim mindset, racist, degenerate garbage that is being used to form the children of our country. We should unashamedly insist that our schools inculcate virtues of justice, real justice, not social justice, temperance, modesty. We should not only push for them to stop promoting promiscuity and abortion in the schools. We should keep doing that. That's a good thing. We should not only do that, but we should also require the schools to teach that marriage is noble and good, that divorce is base and wicked, that those who play the harlot should be looked down on and shamed, and that children are a wonderful blessing to be cherished. We should require them to teach that he who does not work shall not eat, and that to take welfare money when you are an able-bodied man is shameful. In short, we should require them to form the students to be patriotic, hardworking, respectable, marriageable citizens as an absolute baseline. After we get there, maybe we can add wisdom and eloquence on top. If it turns out that all these things are things that conservatives want and go against what liberals want, we shouldn't worry about that. We shouldn't consider this to be a partisan fight. It's not about parties. It's about politics. What is good for the whole polity and for its people? If one side wants to oppose what is good for the nation, the state, or the city, and wants to hate the nation and its people, then they're not even engaged in politics anymore. And we shouldn't be concerned about trying to find neutral ground with them. As teachers, we need to do all the stuff I just said we should require teachers to do. We need to train students from a young age to be disgusted by what is base, wicked, or ignoble, to delight in and love that which is excellent, praiseworthy, and righteous. We do this by how we speak and act, by what heroes we give them, by who we uphold as good examples, and how we deal with sin and vice. Although specific political topics probably won't come up until students are older, we shouldn't shy away from them, as though the wisdom that we are trying to instill in them has nothing to say about marriage law, transgenderism, homosexuality, about shoplifting, redistribution, or reparations. Again, our goal here is not neutrality, even if the topics happen to be politically touchy. Our goal is forming a good man. How will they be capable citizens, let alone leaders, if the education we are giving them has nothing to say about the most important moral and political issues of the day? By upholding models of virtue, we can begin to form their souls toward loving virtue. And by holding Christ continually before their eyes as the most virtuous, most righteous, most excellent, and praiseworthy, we become the hands of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to love God above all things. We also should not settle for the bare minimum, making sure they don't become criminals, meeting the state's academic standards. As Luther says, we should teach them the liberal arts, the languages, true history, excellent literature, that they would be formed to be capable and qualified to lead. We should strive to form the next generation of rulers of our polity, who will fulfill their offices in wisdom and justice. As Luther says, let all people know that it is their chief duty, at the risk of losing divine grace, first, to bring up their children in the fear and knowledge of God, and then, if they are so gifted, also to have them engage in formal study and learn so they may be of service wherever they are needed. If this were done, God would also bless us richly and give us grace so that the people might be trained who would be a credit to the nation and its people. We would also have good, capable citizen, virtuous women who, as good managers of their household, would faithfully raise upright children and servants. May God grant us the strength to do so.
Yes. Repeated expression, we should not, in your paper. Explain your view of the intersection of those words with what we might say is a conservative presumption of parental, if not autonomy, then certainly parental primacy with respect to the education of children.
Yeah, that's a good question. There is certainly this. I should probably stand in front of this. There is certainly that has developed more strongly recently in response to the fact that the government has abandoned its duty to do all the things I just said. But I don't think it's natural. Certainly Luther didn't. He didn't have the idea of parental autonomy from the state, as though that you could educate your child however you wanted and the state had nothing to say about it. But in times where the state has abandoned its duties and is actively undermining what it ought to be doing, the fathers of households have the obligation to resist that and to do what is necessary to do right and justice. So I would like that not to be the case. I would like us not to have to resist the government in order to educate our children well. So, yeah, I mean, the state does have a say here, and the way your children are educated affects the country. And so I think they have a legitimate claim on wanting them to be educated well. They don't have a legitimate claim on wanting them to be educated to be, degenerate waste of space.
So the requirement of a test that all students in polity should pass.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it'd be fine. As an idea, yeah. The way it's executed currently is terrible and actually undermines good education.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Lutheran schools have a legal obligation of sharing the forgiveness of sins, and that's kind of on top of the state as the sword, obviously. How do you see the interaction of that as we try to influence public schools in our area to hold the God-fearing tactics of forgiveness of sins, and also, not talking John Kirby, his shooter? Like, how do we talk to kids about those things in our Lutheran school then suggesting their home schools?
Yeah. So several questions there. To how we deal with the public schools. I don't think we can cover tactics for that in 4 minutes.
Sure.
But the general principle is that we don't make arguments there based on, for now at least, we don't make arguments based on the Bible says. You make arguments for natural law for almost all this stuff. You can even get most of the way to the forgiveness of sins, at least towards letting grudges go from there. And so I think you can make an argument from the natural law, right, as the Greeks and Romans did for a lot of this stuff. And if they could get halfway to this, I'd be pretty pleased. What was your question about the Lutheran schools? Sorry.
Well, I recognize as a Lutheran school teacher that forgiveness of sins is something you need.
Yeah.
We talk about every day.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And as we're talking about politics and influencing the future,
Yeah.
that's what the church kind of brings to all this. We review.
Sure.
And I just question my head. I'm in this unique situation where people like all the schools where I'm actually very conservative, but I'm like, there's still a reason to have a little school, so I'm trying to negotiate that. But my question now is how do we kind of do good in the most for theirs versus,
Yeah, and maybe I wasn't quite clear enough about that in here, that this is the secondary purpose of the school, right? So your argument is that there's a primary purpose to the school that public school cannot do, right, which is to raise them in the fear and the knowledge of God. We had public schools once upon a time that did that, but they don't anymore. So, and I'm not sure we should go back to that. That's, again, a tactics question. But I mean, that's the argument for the Lutheran school, is that it fulfills the primary purpose of education. And as Dr. Boyle said, to know Christ.
So if Luther was ashamed of school financing, how much more should we be ashamed?
Yeah.
Is it like we just forgotten this, or are we just as Lutherans we have a hands-off approach to the state that we're pleased enough to say our Lutheran schools will teach about Jesus?
Yeah.
If you don't, it's a full stop.
So a couple of things. One is the schools at Luther's time were actually pretty bad. I mean, they weren't actively promoting.
Like there is ideology that it's
Right. They weren't actively promoting evil in the same way that ours are. I think there's a lot of stuff that goes into sort of the quietism that is instinctive to Lutherans in America. I don't think it's natural to Lutherans generally. You look at the early Lutherans, they were not exactly quietistic. Sort of the opposite of that. It's just a habit we need to break ourselves of. I think a lot of the reasons that we came here in the first place, the way we isolated ourselves from the culture at the beginning by sort of refusing to integrate, then the violence and the forced integration that happened around the world wars, it made us want to just kind of step back from all that and just be quiet and not be noticed. So there's sort of like a long cultural thing that we have that we just sort of need to get over, and learn to take the risk that maybe they'll hate us and we should go say stuff anyway. Yeah. Yeah.
Do we have time to go more?
Sure. I'll answer fast.
I'll try. Can you elucidate for me what you think would be the difference between the Lutheran approach to these issues and an aggressive Baptist approach? Does that much make sense?
Yes. The two kingdoms. The Baptists would be trying to like win the country for Jesus.
Yeah.
I'm saying the country should be governed under God's
I totally agree that like public schools should praise marriage and
Yeah.
divorce.
Yeah.
And actually religion too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Be godless. But I mean, I guess
So my goal is not the salvation of all of the people in the country in this respect. Right? That is the job of this hand. Right? When we're talking about this hand, I'm not trying to save these people. I'm trying to enforce civic righteousness. That might save them. Oh no. Mostly it just curbs them, right? Which is what I want. So that's the distinction. Is the Baptist just says there's only one hand, and the goal of this is to make everybody in the whole school into a Christian. I just want them to behave.
yeah. So like, Doug Wilson wants Congress to pass a resolution saying that Jesus rose from the dead. Well, I'm not opposed to that.
Fine, sure.
But
I don't
like,
think that's going to do any good,
yeah.
I'd rather have, Congress pass a budget. So,
Yeah.
The other distinction between the two hands is what each hand is able to accomplish.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
So obviously the right hand, the left hand king is not able to say,
Right.
and that's your point about the Baptists.
Yeah.
They just,
Congress can't preach.
Yeah, I don't want Congress preaching the gospel. Please.
Right.
It's not the goal. I want them preaching moral law. All right. Thank you.